Fingal. The last girl he went with, before a memorable fit of laughing incapacitated him from gallantry for some time, was pretty, hot, and witty, in that order. So one fine spring morning he brought her out into the country, to the hill of Feltram in the country. They turned east off the road from Dublin to Malahide, short of the castle woods, and soon it came into view, not much more than a burrow, the ruin of a mill on the top, choked layers of furze and brambles pass him on its gentle slopes. It was a landmark for miles around on account of the high ruin, the Hill of the Wolves. They had not been very long on the top before he began to feel a very sad animal indeed. But she was, to all appearances, in high spirits, enjoying the warm sun and the prospect. "The Dublin mountains," she said. "Don't they look lovely, so dreamy?" Now Belacqua was looking intently in the opposite direction, across the estuary. "It's the east wind," he said. She began to admire this and that, the ridge of Lambay Island rising out of the brown woods of the castle, Island's eye like a shark, and the ridiculous little hills so far away to the north. What were they? "The Knoll," said Belacqua. "Is it possible you didn't know the Knoll?" This in the shocked tone of the travelled spinster. "You don't say you were in Millen, to rhyme with villain, and never saw the Sena? Can it be possible that you passed through Chambéry and never called on Madame de Warren?" "North Dublin," she said. "I don't know at all. So flat and dull, all roads leading to Drogheda." "Fingal dull?" he said. "Winnie, you astonish me." They considered Fingal for a time together in silence, its coast eaten away with creeks and marshes, tesserae of small fields, patches of wood springing up like a weed, the line of hills too low to close the view. "When it's a magic land," he sighed, "like Saône-et-Loire." "That means nothing to me," said Winnie. "Oh yes," he said, "bon vin et Lamartine, a champagne land for the sad and serious, not a bloody little toy kindergarten like Wicklow." "You make great play with your short stay abroad," thought Winnie. "You and your sad and serious," she said. "Will you never come off it?" "Well," he said, "I'll give you Alphonse." She replied that he could keep him. Things were beginning to blow up nasty. "What's that on your face?" she said sharply. "Impetigo," said Belacqua. He had felt it coming with a terrible itch in the night, and in the morning it was there. Soon it would be a scab. "And you kiss me," she exclaimed, "with that on your face." "I forgot," he said. "I get so excited, you know." She spittled on her handkerchief and wiped her mouth. Belacqua lay humbly beside her, expecting her to get up and leave him. But instead she said, "What is it anyway? What does it come from?" "Dirt," said Belacqua. "You see it on slum children." A long, awkward silence followed these words. "Don't pick it, darling," she said unexpectedly at last. "You'll make it worse." This came to Belacqua like a drink of water to drink in a dungeon. Her goodwill must have meant something to him. He returned to Fingal to cover his confusion. "I often come to this hill," he said, "to have a view of Fingal, and each time I see it more as a backland, a land of sanctuary, a land that you don't have to dress up, that you can walk on in a lounge suit, smoking a cigar." What a gazer, she thought, and where much has been suffered in secret, especially by women. "This is all a dream," she said. "I see nothing but 3 acres and cows, and you can't have Cincinnatus without a furrow." Now it was she who was sulky, and he who was happy. Oh, Winnie. He made a vague clutch at her sincerities, for she was all anyway on the grass. You look very Roman this minute. He loves me, she said, in earnest jest. Only pout, he begged. Be Roman, and we'll go on across the estuary. And then? And then, Winnie, take thought. I see, he said. You take thought. Shall we execute a contract? No need, she said. He was as wax in her hands. She twisted him this way and that. But now their moods were in accordance. Things were somehow very pleasant all of a sudden. She gazed long at the area of contention, and he willed her not to speak, to remain there with her grave face, a quiet puella in a blurred world. But she spoke, who shall silence them at last, saying that she saw nothing but the grey fields of serfs and the ramparts of ex-favourites. Saw? They were all the same when it came to the pinch. Clods. If she closed her eyes, she might see something. He would drop the subject. He would not try to communicate Fingal. He would lock it up in his mind. So much the better. Look, he pointed. She looked, blinking for the focus. The big red building, he said, across the water with the towers. At last, she thought she saw what he meant. Far away, she said, with the round tower. Do you know what that is? He said. Because my heart's right there. Well, she thought, you lay your cards on the table. No, she said. It looks like a bread factory to me. The Portrain Lunatic Asylum, he said. Oh, she said, I know a doctor there. Thus, she having a friend, he his heart, in Portrain, they agreed to make for there. They followed the estuary all the way around, admiring the theories of swans and the coots, over the dunes and past the Martello Tower, so that they came on Portrain from the south and the sea, instead of, like a vehicle, by the railway bridge and the horrible red chapel of Donabate. The place was as full of towers as Dun Laguerre, of steeples, 2 Martello, the red ones of the asylum, a water tower, and the round. Trespassing unawares, for the notice board was further on towards the Coast Guard station, they climbed the rising ground to this latter. They followed the grass margin of a ploughed field, till they came to where a bicycle was lying half hidden in the rank grass. Belacqua, who could on no account resist a bicycle, thought, what an extraordinary place to come across one. The owner was out in the field, scarifying the dry furrows with a fork. Is this right for the tower? Cried Belacqua. The man turned his head. Can we get up to the tower? Cried Belacqua. The man straightened up and pointed. Fire ahead, he said. Over the wall, cried Belacqua. There was no need for him to shout. A conversational tone would have been heard across the quiet field, but he was so anxious to make himself clear, he so dreaded the thought of having to repeat himself, that he not merely raised his voice, but put on a flat accent that astonished Winnie. Don't be an idiot, she said. If it's straight on, it's over the wall. But the man seemed pleased that the wall had been mentioned. Or perhaps he was just glad of an opportunity to leave his work, for he dropped his fork and came lumbering over to where they were standing. There was nothing at all noteworthy about his appearance. He said that their way lay straight ahead, yes, over the wall, and then the tower was on top of the field, or else they could go back till they came to the road, and go along it till they came to the banks, and follow up the banks. The banks? Was this fellow one of the more harmless lunatics? Belacqua asked was the tower an old one, as though it required a Dr. Petrie to see that it was not. The man said it had been built for relief in the year of the famine, so he had heard, by a Mrs. Somebody whose name he misremembered in honour of her husband. "Well, Winnie," said Belacqua, "over the wall or follow up the banks?" "There is a rare view of Lambay from the top," said the man. Winnie was in favour of the wall. She thought that it would be more direct now that they had come so far. The man began to work this out. Belacqua had no one but himself to blame if they never got away from this machine. "But I would like to see the banks," he said. "If we went on now," said Winnie, "now that we have come so far, and followed the banks down, how would that be?" They agreed, Belacqua and the man, that it needed a woman to think these things out. Suddenly, there was a tie between them. The tower began well. That was the funeral meets. But from the door up, it was all relief and no honour. That was the marriage tables. They had not been long on the top before Belacqua was a sad animal again. They sat on the grass with their faces to the sea, and the asylum was all below and behind them. "Right enough," said Winnie. "I never saw Lambay look so close." Belacqua could see the man scraping away at his furrow, and felt a sudden longing to be down there in the clay, lending a hand. He checked the explanation of this that was beginning, and looked at the soft cord of yellow on the slope, gorse and ragwort juxtaposed. "The lovely ruins," said Winnie. "There on the left, covered with ivy." Of a church and, 2 small fields further on, a square boneless tower. "That," said Belacqua, "is where I have sursum corda." "Then hadn't we better be getting on?" said Winnie, quick as lightning. "This absurd tower," he said, now that he had been told, "is before the asylum, and they are before the tower." He didn't say, "The crenels on the wall I find as moving." Now the loonies poured out into the sun, the better behaved left to their own devices, the others in herds in charge of warders. The whistle blew and the herd stopped. Again, and it proceeded. "As moving," he said, "and moving in the same way as the colour of the brick in the old mill at Feltram. Who shall silence them at last?" "It's pinked," continued Belacqua, "and as a little fat overfed boy I sat on the floor with a hammer and a pinking iron, scalloping the edge of a red cloth." "What ails you?" said Winnie. He had allowed himself to get run down, but he scoffed at the idea of a sequitur from his body to his mind. "I must be getting old and tired," he said, "when I find the nature outside me compensating for the nature inside me, like Jean-Jacques sprawling in a bed of saxifrages." "Appearing to compensate," she said. She was not sure what she meant by this, but it sounded well. "And then," he said, "I want very much to be back in the coal, on my back in the dark forever." "A short ever," she said, "and working day and night." The beastly punctilio of women. "Damn it," he said, "you know what I mean. No shaving, or haggling, or cold, or hugger-mugger, no." He cast about for a term of ample connotation. "No night sweats." Below in the playground on their right, some of the milder patients were kicking a football. Others were lounging about, alone and in knots, taking their ease in the sun. The head of one appeared over the wall, the hands on the wall, the cheek on the hands. Another, he must have been a very tame one, came halfway up the slope, disappeared into a hollow, emerged after a moment, and went back the way he'd come. Another, his back turned to them, stood fumbling at the wall that divided the grounds of the asylum from the field where they were. One of the gangs was walking round and round the playground. Below, on the other hand, a long line of workmen's dwellings. In the gardens, children playing and crying. Abstract the asylum, and there was little left to portray but ruins. Winnie remarked that the lunatics seemed very sane and well behaved to her. Belacqua agreed, but he thought that the head over the wall told a tale. Landscapes were of interest to Belacqua only insofar as they furnished him with the pretext for a long face. Suddenly, the owner of the bicycle was running towards them up the hill, grasping the fork. He came barging over the wall, through the cord of yellow, and pounding along the crest of the slope. Belacqua rose feebly to his feet. This maniac, with the strength of 10 men at least, who should withstand him? He would beat him into a puddle with his fork, and violate Winnie. But he bore away as he drew near. For a moment they could hear his panting, and plunged on over the shoulder of the rise. Gathering speed on the downgrade, he darted through the gate in the wall and disappeared round a corner of the building. Belacqua looked at Winnie, whom he found staring down at where the man had, as it were, gone to ground, and then away at the distant point where he had watched him scraping his furrows and been envious. The nickel of the bike sparkled in the sun. The next thing was Winnie waving and halloing. Belacqua turned and saw a man walking smartly towards them up the slope from the asylum. "Dr. Sholto," said Winnie. Dr. Sholto was some years younger than Belacqua, a pale, dark man with a brow. He was delighted, how would he say, at so unexpected a pleasure. Honoured, he was sure, to make the acquaintance of any friend of Miss Coates. Now they would do him the favour to adjourn. This meant drink. But Belacqua, having other fish to fry, sighed and improvised a long, courteous statement to the effect that there was a point in connection with the church which he was most anxious to check at first hand, so that if he might accept on behalf of Miss Coates, who was surely tired after her long walk from Malahide. "Malahide!" ejaculated Dr. Sholto. And, be himself excused, they could all three meet at the main entrance of the asylum in, say, an hour. How would that be? Dr. Sholto demurred politely. Winnie thought hard and said nothing. "I'll go down by the banks," said Belacqua agreeably, "and follow the road round. Au revoir." They stood for a moment watching him depart. When he ventured to look back, they were gone. He changed his course and came to where the bicycle lay in the grass. It was a fine, light machine, with red tires and wooden rims. He ran down the margin to the road, and it bounded alongside under his hand. He mounted, and they flew down the hill and round the corner till they came at length to the stile that led into the field where the church was. The machine was a treat to ride. On his right hand the sea was foaming among the rocks. The sands ahead were another yellow again. Beyond them in the distance the cottages of Rush were bright white. Belacqua's sadness fell from him like a shift. He carried the bicycle into the field and laid it down on the grass. He hastened on foot, without so much as a glance at the church, across the fields, over a wall and ditch, and stood before the poor wooden door of the tower. The locked appearance of this did not deter him. He gave it a kick, it swung open, and he went in. Meantime, Dr. Sholto, in his pleasantly appointed sanctum, improved the occasion with Miss Winifred Coates. Thus they were all met together in Portrain, Winnie, Belacqua, his heart, and Dr. Sholto, and paired off to the satisfaction of all parties. Surely it is in such little adjustments that the benevolence of the first cause appears beyond dispute. Winnie kept her eye on the time, and arrived punctually with her friend at the main entrance. There was no sign of her other friend. Late, said Winnie, as usual. In respect of Belacqua, Sholto felt nothing but rancour. Pah, he said. He'll be sandpapering a tomb. A stout block of an old man in shirt-sleeves and slippers was leaning against the wall of the field. Winnie still sees, as vividly as when they met her anxious gaze for the first time, his great purple face and white moustaches. Had he seen a stranger about, a pale fat man in a black leather coat? No, miss, he said. Well, said Winnie, settling herself on the wall. To Sholto, I suppose he's about somewhere. A land of sanctuary, he had said, where much had been suffered secretly. Yes, the last ditch. You stay here, said Sholto, madness and evil in his heart, and I'll take a look in the church. The old man had been showing signs of excitement. Is it an escape? He inquired hopefully. No, no, said Winnie, just a friend. But he was off. He was unsluiced. I was born on Lambay, he said, by way of opening to an endless story of a recapture in which he had distinguished himself. And I've worked here, man and boy. In that case, said Winnie, maybe you can tell me what the ruins are. That's the church, he said, pointing to the near one. It had just absorbed Sholto. And that, pointing to the far one, is the tower. Yes, said Winnie, but what tower? What is it? The best I know, he said, is some lady something had it. This was news indeed. Then, before that again, it all came back to him with a rush. You might have heard tell of Dane Swift. He checked the word and then let it come regardless. He kept a mott in it. A moth? Exclaimed Winnie. A mott, he said, of the name Stella. Winnie stared out across the grey field. No sign of Sholto, nor of Belacqua. Only this puce mass up against her, and a tail of mott and a star. What was a mott? You mean, she said, that he lived there with a woman? He kept her there, said the old man. He had read it in an old telegraph, and he would adhere to it, and came down from Dublin. Little fat presto. He would set out early in the morning, fresh and fasting, and walk like a chamomile. Sholto appeared on the stile in the crenellated wall, waving blankly. Winnie began to feel that she had made a mess of it. God knows, she said to Sholto when he came up, where he is. You can't hang around here all night, he said. Let me drive you home. I have to go out to Dublin anyhow. I can't leave him, wailed Winnie. But he's not here, damn it, said Sholto. If he was, he'd be here. The old man, who knew his Sholto, stepped into the breach with a tender of his services. He would keep his eyes open. Now, said Sholto, he can't expect you to wait here forever. A young man on a bicycle came slowly round the corner from the Donabate direction, saluted the group, and was turning into the drive of the asylum. Tom! Cried Sholto. Tom dismounted. Sholto gave a brief satirical description of Belacqua's person. You didn't see that on the road, he said, did you? I passed the felly of it on a bike, said Tom, pleased to be of use. At Ross's gate, going like flames. On a bike? Cried Winnie. But he hadn't a bike. Tom, said Sholto, get out the car, look sharp now, and run her down here. But it can't have been him. Winnie was furious for several reasons. I tell you, he had no bike. Whoever it is, said Sholto, master of the situation, will pass him before he gets to the main road. But Sholto had underestimated the speed of his man, who was safe in Taylor's public house in Swords, drinking in a way that Mr. Taylor did not like, before they were well on their way.